Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking the absolutely epic journey of Joshua. We're talking about a guy whose life story goes from being an enslaved brickmaker all the way to a divine military commander. It completely flips the traditional script on what it actually means to be a hero. Let's dive in and see how true strength is really built.
Now, to really wrap our heads around this, we have to start with a super pivotal, tension-filled moment. Picture this. Joshua is standing right outside the massive, imposing walls of Jericho. He's the top general, literally about to lead a massive invasion. Suddenly, he comes face to face with this towering, divine figure holding a drawn sword. Operating just like any seasoned military commander would, Joshua asks the ultimate human question: are you for us or for our enemies? Basically, he wants to know, in this impending war, whose side is God actually on?
And the commander of the Lord's army delivers a shocking one-word response that just completely shatters conventional thinking. He says, no. That's it, just no. This establishes a totally foundational truth for our explainer right off the bat. God is not some mercenary for human agendas. He doesn't just sign up to back our battles. Instead, we're the ones being invited to surrender to his.
So to understand exactly how Joshua reached that profound moment of total surrender, we actually need to rewind a bit. Joshua wasn't born into royalty, not at all. He was really a helper in the shadows, born right into the dark, oppressive slavery of Egypt. He spent his early years making bricks under the brutal whips of Pharaoh. Eventually, though, during the 40-year wilderness wandering, he becomes Moses' right-hand man. His fundamental training? It wasn't in some elite military academy. It was actually in the shadow of the sacred tent, where Scripture says he just lingered, learning how to be in the presence of God. And this dynamic perfectly illustrates his very first real combat experience at a place called Rephidim. While Joshua's down there fighting with the sword in the dust on the ground, Moses is up high holding the staff in the light on the mountain. This was a massive paradigm shift for a young warrior. Joshua learned firsthand that earthly victory on the ground is completely dependent on heavenly intercession up on the mountain. You can swing a sword all day long, but the true power source? It's always above.
All right, let's fast forward a few decades. Moses has passed away, and Joshua is now stepping up to take full command. He successfully leads 2 million Israelites across the miraculously parted Jordan River right into Canaan. But while they're encamped in the very heart of enemy territory at Gilgal, God gives him a wildly bizarre strategic command: circumcise all the male warriors. Think about that for just a second. From a purely military standpoint, this is practically a suicidal command. It would leave the entire army completely incapacitated, unable to defend themselves in incredibly hostile territory.
But this extreme vulnerability in Gilgal proved an absolutely vital lesson. Vulnerability actually has to come before victory. It proved that their greatest weapon wasn't a freshly sharpened sword, but an absolute, defenseless trust in God to be their ultimate shield. It was a physical cutting away of their past shame and a radical, total reliance on divine protection way before they ever drew a single weapon in combat.
And this radical reliance carries right over into their first major battle at Jericho. Talk about a humanly illogical divide and conquer strategy. They were commanded to march around the city once a day in complete silence for 7 days, before finally blowing the ram's horns. Just imagine thousands of soldiers, fully armed, walking in dead silence, while the enemy is likely up there mocking them from the walls. This intense silence wasn't just some clever psychological tactic. It was the ultimate show of absolute obedience to a higher plan. They were literally letting God dictate every single term of engagement.
And then the horns blow. The silence is instantly shattered by a sudden, deafening blast and a massive shout from the entire army. And just like that, those massive, seemingly impenetrable walls come crashing down. It was a perfect, earth-shaking victory born entirely out of perfect submission. But wow, the euphoric high of that Jericho victory was almost immediately shattered. At a much smaller city called Ai, 36 Israelite soldiers were unexpectedly killed, and the entire army was sent running in a pretty humiliating defeat. Joshua was absolutely devastated. How could they conquer massive Jericho only to be routed by a tiny settlement?
Well, the explanation for that shocking defeat came down to a single ancient concept: cherem. This refers to devoted things, sacred items that were completely consecrated to God and had to be destroyed to maintain the community's holiness. Come to find out, a soldier named Achan had secretly stolen some of these devoted items during the Jericho victory. This illustrates a really harsh theological truth. A warrior's most fatal vulnerability isn't some stronger, taller enemy waiting outside the camp. It's the hidden, internal sin inside the camp. God's power just could not flow where there was hidden compromise.
Now, once they dealt with that internal compromise, their victory was restored. But Joshua's spiritual integrity was quickly put to the test again, this time by an alliance. The Gibeonites were these terrified locals who actually disguised themselves in worn-out clothes and completely tricked Joshua into signing a binding peace treaty. When Joshua finally figured out the deception, he had a massive political and ethical choice to make.
Amazingly, despite the complete deception, Joshua chose to honor the covenant. When 5 southern kings attacked Gibeon, Joshua could have easily used political loopholes to just let his tricked allies be wiped out. It would have saved his own troops, right? But he flat out refuses. Instead, he executes a grueling all-night rescue march to save the very people who lied to his face. And because he honored his word and his covenant before God, God intervened miraculously, casting down deadly hailstones from the sky that actually took out more enemies than the Israelite swords did. And right in the heat of that chaotic, miraculous battle, Joshua steps up and makes one of the most absolutely audacious prayers in history. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon. He literally issues a theology-shifting demand to freeze time itself, just so they can finish the battle before darkness falls.
And get this, God actually answered this astonishing prayer, stopping the sun in the sky for nearly a full day. This proves a pretty staggering reality. The natural order serves the divine plan. When a warrior fights with absolute integrity and completely aligns with God's purposes, the very universe itself will bend to assist him. It's incredible.
So, with the major battles finally won, it's time to divide up the newly conquered territory. And here, we see a stark contrast. Your typical worldly conqueror instinctively takes the best, most fertile plains first, right? They demand the ultimate spoils of war. But Joshua demonstrates a true servant's heart. He steps back and lets every single other tribe claim their rich, fertile land first, voluntarily choosing the rugged, leftover mountains for himself last.
Let's look a bit closer at exactly what he chose. The place is called Timnath Serah. The literal translation here is super fascinating. It literally means the remaining portion, or quite simply, leftovers. Joshua, the grand commander of Israel, the guy who led the whole charge, actively chose a rugged, rocky piece of hill country in Ephraim that required intense, backbreaking labor to cultivate.
So you've got to ask, why on earth would he do that when he could have had literally any land he wanted? Well, it was simply because of its proximity to the sanctuary. He chose this leftover land because it was geographically close to Shiloh, which is where the Ark of the Covenant rested. He valued God's presence far above prime real estate. From a young guy who wouldn't leave Moses' tent to an old man who just wanted to live near the sanctuary, his core heart never changed. And this brings us to the twilight of his life, a final gathering at Shechem. Reaching an impressive 110 years of age, Joshua summons all the elders to a historic altar. And I really want you to notice what he doesn't do here. He constructs no monuments to his own conquests. He doesn't stand up there and brag about his brilliant military records. Instead, he uses the moment to issue a final historical challenge to the people.
Looking back at his timeline, we can really see the overarching theme of his entire life. From a slave in Egypt, to Moses' assistant, to military commander, and finally, a servant of the Lord, his life so brilliantly illustrates the core narrative of our explainer today. In God's economy, true strength and true elevation are found by descending into much deeper humility and submission.
And from that place of really deep, hard-earned humility, he delivers his famous final declaration. You've probably heard this powerful quote before. "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." He passionately urges the millions of Israelites standing right there before him to abandon their past idols, to stop wavering back and forth between cultures, and to definitively choose their ultimate loyalty, just exactly as he has done his entire life.
Ultimately, upon his passing, Scripture gives Joshua its highest, most honorable title. It forever cements his legacy not as a ruthless conqueror, not as a brilliant tactician, or a proud king, but simply as a devoted servant of the Lord. He was a man who completely surrendered his sword to the true commander.
Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with today. In the battles of your own life, whose side are you truly fighting for? Are you constantly trying to hire a higher power to bless your own personal plans? Or are you willing to take off your sandals and submit as a true servant to a much greater design? Really think about that as you face your own battles this week. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep learning.